第一分科会を始めたいと思います。この分科会は、朝鮮半島の平和と非核化の進展、北東アジアの核なき未来というテーマで行います。コーディネーターは私、梅林博道、核兵器廃絶
ステージを中心に
核兵器廃絶研究センター、長崎大学のレクナの客員教授です。前のセンター長でありました。でもう一人一緒に務めますのは広瀬聡副センター長です。
はい、梅林先生と一緒にコーディネーターを務めさせていただきますレクナの広瀬です。よろしくお願いいたします。
この分科会は、第1部と第2部に、分かれています。第1部にもうすでに席についております3名のゲストからの話をいただきます。で第2部で、あと4名のゲストから話をいただきます。でちょうど県人会議に、参加していた専門家の方々が、今日のこのテーマに非常に貴重な発言をしていただけるということで、少し人数が多いですが、またとない機会ですので、この方々みんなの、最前線の話をお聞きしたいというのが、このセッションの大きな目的です。で第1部ではですね、鈴木達次郎さん現ベトナムセンター長から、朝鮮半島を巡る情勢、それが日本とどのように関わるか、日本、レクナが目指してきた核兵器、東アジア非核兵器地帯の取り組みとどのようにつながるかというようなことを、全般的な、ある意味では主催者の、イントロダクションというような包括的な話をしていただきたいと思っています。続いてピーター・エイズさん、もう長く北朝鮮問題の専門家としてよく知られている世界的な研究者です。ノーチラス研究所、サンフランシスコとどこですか、シドニーです。オーストラリアと両方に拠点を持って、活動をなさっています。レクナが事務局を務めています北東アジア平和と安全保障のためのパネル、専門家委員会というのがあるんですけれども、そのメンバーとして、もうずっと最初から関わってきていただいています。ピーター・エイズさんからは、長い蓄積の中で今朝鮮半島の情勢をどのように捉えているかというような、全体的な話をいただきたいと思っています。それからアンジェラ・ケインさん、国連事務次長として、軍縮安全保障、軍縮問題の、担当をなさっていた軍縮局の責任者でもありました。今の中光さんの前任の事務長で、やられました。現在、県人会議の一メンバーでもありまして、今日この会議に参加していただくことができたということです。この第一部ではそういうわけで、かなり全体的な視点から、朝鮮半島情勢をどのように捉えるかということを、学ぶ、そして皆さんのご質問は後で受けるチャンスがあると思いますが、第一セッションではまずお三方の話を聞くというふうに設定をしていましたので、ご清聴ください。では鈴木さん、よろしくお願いします。
はい、こんにちは。ただいま紹介に預かりました長崎大学レクナの鈴木です。よろしくお願いします。ではスライドをお願いいたします。この今日さっきいただいたんです、ちょっと貸していただいたんですけど、これ指輪みたいになってるんですけど、これがリモコンで動くんだそうです。面白い。これリングみたいで、すごい魔法のリングみたいです。はい、では 早速、いきたいと思いますが、私からのですね、メッセージ、これはこのタイトルに表しております。この現在、すでにですね、何人かの方が、オープニングセッションでもお話しされましたが、現在起きているこの北東アジアの素晴らしい動きですね、もちろんいろいろまだ問題点はいっぱいありますが、この機会を逃してはいけないというのが、この私からの最大のメッセージです。で、これをですね、実は今、梅林先生、実は梅林先生がですね、長年ずっとこの問題を提案されてきた、本当は梅林先生がここに座ってですね、そのお話をされるのが一番いいと思うんですが、梅林先生がずっと長年温めてこられたですね、北東アジア核兵器地帯がまさにですね、実現するかもしれないという、この好機を逃してはいけないというのが、私の最大のメッセージです。それでは次行かせていただきます。これですね、左側にあるのがですね、イギリスの雑誌のエコノミストという雑誌、なかなかユーモアがあってですね、私好きな雑誌の一つなんですが、左側2016年ですね、非常に北朝鮮の動きが懸念の的になりまして、何を言っても言うことを言えないと。で、頭にキノコ雲がありますが、これウェブサイトへ行きますとですね、このキノコ雲が動くんです。非常に凝っているんですけども、地上にある危機的な状況にあった2016年、さらに去年はもっと、トランプ政権の誕生で厳しい状況になったわけですが、で右側見ていただきたいんですが、米朝歴史的な会談の後の特集号なんですけど、よく見ていただきますと、キム・ジョン・ウンではなくて、キム・ジョン・ウォンになっています。ということは、エコノミストの評価はですね、北朝鮮の方が一枚上手だったという、評価という特集記事なんですが、確かにそういう面はあったかもしれませんが、私としてはですね、この米朝の歴史的な対話ということをですね、いい機会として次につなげていきたいということをお話したいと思います。でその前にですね、まず南北首脳会談、これが行われました。これも歴史的な対談だったわけですが、これですね、レクナでですね、その意義についてですね、すぐ見解を出させていただきます。で1番目がですね、今日黒沢先生からもお話がありましたが、2つの大きなメッセージが、朝鮮戦争の終結と、それから朝鮮半島の非核化で、この2つは非常に大きなメッセージでありますが、我々としてはですね、その意義を備えた踏まえた上で、もう少しこれから具体化を進めていくことが大事だ。だから2番目はですね、この南北朝鮮の対話は素晴らしいわけですが、朝鮮戦争の終結もそうですし、朝鮮半島の非核化を考えても、地域の国々がやはり多国間で話をする、多国間交渉をやっぱりやっていく必要がある。日本について言えば、当然、日朝関係、北朝鮮との国交正常化に向けてですね、対話を始めるべきだというのが2番目に書かせていただきます。3番目、これはですね、短期的な大変重要なことなんですが、トップ同士で話が始まってもですね、何かの間違いで軍事的な対立が起きるかもしれない、非常に緊張関係にありましたが、そういう意味ではですね、早期に危機管理システムを作る。これは南北ではそういうことに合意しているわけですが、アメリカと北朝鮮の間でもそういう合意が必要だということを言わせていただきます。もう一つ、9月の平壌共同宣言、これはですね、さらに意義が深い。まず第一にですね、中身を読んでみますと、この事実上の朝鮮戦争の終結ということを謳っている。もう南北では戦争をしないということをですね、明らかにしているというふうに我々は読んでおります。でこれはですね、この朝鮮半島の緊張緩和に大きく貢献すると思います。 この具体的にですね、特に軍と軍の間でかなり細かいですね、戦争をしないための仕組み、非武装化を進めていくということが合意できていますので、事実上、朝鮮戦争はもう終わったというふうに南北は考えているというふうに思います。2番目はですね、前回の会談でははっきりしていなかった非核化とミサイルの件でですね、2つ具体的な行動を北朝鮮が明らかにした。トンチャンリのミサイル発射台とエンジン試験場の永久廃棄、それを関係国の専門家の立ち会いで進める。もう一つは4分の核施設についてですね、米国が米朝共同声明の精神に基づいて、それ相応の措置を取るという条件ではありますが、永久廃棄に応じるということを具体化明らかにしたということは、注目すべき第一歩だと我々は評価しています。3番目に、今これでですね、南北朝鮮はかなり前へ進んだわけですから、その相手側であるアメリカ、それから周辺諸国がこれに対してより積極的に対応していくべきだというふうな見解を出させていただきます。それでは、トランプとのですね、米朝対談の意義なんですけども、これを読ませていただきますとですね、まさに歴史的、ショッキングな、本当に素晴らしい内容ではあるんですが、我々はこれは千載一遇の好機と言いましたが、大きく言えば、やはり2つ重要なポイントがある。宣言というのはですね、政治的宣言というのは、すごいポリティカルには意味があるわけですが、逆戻りをしないための仕組みが必要である。不可逆的な方向に持っていかなきゃいけない。そのためには、2つの制度化という言葉をですね、使わせていただいたんですが、これは、例えば非核化で言えばですね、大事なことは、検証措置を、透明性のある形で、しかも法的拘束力のある形で検証制度を作っていく。実はですね、核兵器国、核兵器を持った国が、段階的に核兵器をなくしていくというプロセスを国際的な枠組みの中で検証したということは今まで一度もないわけです。アメリカとロシアは2国間でそういう検証制度を作りました。これが先ほど話題になりました INF、中距離核戦略全廃条約。ここで初めてですね、米ロ間で相互の検証措置の義務付けを行ったわけですが、そういう意味でも INF の条約の意味が非常に大きいわけですけど、国際的な検証措置というのは未だにあります。核兵器禁止条約にはですね、その検証制度を作るということが書いてあるんですが、まだ詳細な制度はできていませんので、この段階的に核兵器を減らしていくプロセスをどうやって作っていくかということは非常に重要な課題として残されています。でこれをきちんとですね、法的拘束力を持った検証制度を作って、これを不可逆的なものにしていくというのが第一のポイントです。第2のポイントは、平和の制度化。これはですね、朝鮮戦争の終結、宣言だけではなくて、実際にそれを法的に終わらせる。それからアメリカが北朝鮮と平和条約を結ぶ。あるいは日本と北朝鮮が国交正常化する。関係諸国全部がですね、この地域で平和の枠組みを作っていく。こういうことが大事だと。これもですね、できれば条約、国際的な法的拘束力を持ったものにしていくことが大事だということを書かせていただきます。で、これらの動きをですね、よくずっと見てみますと、実はですね、ゴルバイセンター長でセンター長の時に、レクナが提案した朝鮮半島の非核化から北東アジア非核兵器地帯に向けてですね、包括的なアプローチを提言する。これのコンセプトにですね、非常に近いというふうに我々は考えています。ちょっと中身をもう一度復習していきたいんですが、これが2015年に 発表した、包括的アプローチの中身なんですが、よく見ていただきますと、4つ大きなポイントがありまして、第1が朝鮮戦争の終結、これを宣言する、それでお互いに、攻撃をしないというですね、約束をする、これが第1ですね。で2番目はインセンティブになるようにですね、エネルギーや宇宙技術についてのアクセスを認めてあげる。だから3番目がこの一番大事なところですが、北東アジア非核兵器地帯の条約を締結する。これは後で詳しくお話します。でもう一つ、実は非核化だけではなくて、北東アジア全体の安全保障を議論する枠組みを作っていく必要があるということで、ここではですね、欧州にあるような、パーマネント、常設の北東アジア安全保障協議会を作ってですね、非核化だけではなくて、通常の兵器の軍縮やですね、信頼関係を作っているという、この4つのパッケージでですね、北東アジアの平和と安全保障を確保する。これがレクナが2015年に発表した包括的アプローチの内容です。で、今起きていることは、まさにこれと並行して、これに近い形でですね、起きているのではないかという現実がですね。ということで、我々は非常に勇気づけられているということであります。で、この、北東アジア非核兵器地帯といってもですね、いろいろ昔からですね、いろんな提案が出されているんですが、これは3+3 というのは、小林先生が、90年代から提唱されていることで、朝鮮半島の2カ国と日本、この3カ国が、非核兵器地帯を作り、周りの周辺の核保有国であるロシア、中国、アメリカが、この3カ国に対して、非核兵器地帯の3カ国に対して、核兵器で攻撃や威嚇をしない、いわゆる消極的安全保障、ネガティブセキュリティアシュランスですが、これを約束する。これが3+3 の、北東アジア核兵器地帯のコンセプトです。で、今ですね、もうすでに2カ国、北朝鮮と韓国で朝鮮半島の非核化に、合意しようとしています。で、これがもし本当に条約のようになってですね、この2カ国に対してアメリカ、中国、ロシアが攻撃をしないという約束をしたら、朝鮮半島の非核兵器地帯がということが現実になります。となれば、これに日本が参加することができればですね、そういう意思を示せば、この北東アジア核兵器地帯というのが完成する。我々は考えています。で、この、核兵器地帯の一番のポイントは何かということなんですけど、今お話しましたように、いわゆるこれ国連でですね、ちゃんと、認証されることが大事なんですが、国際的な法的拘束力を持ってですね、右の3つが約束される。地域に核兵器は置かない。核兵器はもう一切持ち込まない。で、2番目に、法的拘束力がある検証説が取り入れられる。で、3番目、これが大事だと思いますが、地域の非核兵器国に対して、核兵器国がですね、攻撃や威嚇を行わないこと、先ほど申しました消極的安全保障の行為、この3つをセットにして、核兵器地帯というのが作られるわけですが、となりますと、下に書いてあるように、この地域では核の傘に頼らない安全保障が構築されるということで、これがもし本当にできてですね、日本が、あるいは韓国が核の傘に依存しない安全保障の仕組みができていけばですね、核兵器禁止条約にも参加できるのではないか、我々は考えています。で、今、朝鮮半島でまさにそれが起きようとしている。で、最後ですね、で日本はどうするんだということなんですね。で、もう一度、復習します。朝鮮半島の非核兵器地帯化 ですね、これは十分に今、実現可能と考えられます。で、もしですね、日本がこれに参加しないとしたらどうなるか、ちょっと考えていただきたいんですが、実はですね、朝鮮半島の非核化といったときに、当然、在韓米軍非核化というのも検証の対象になります。でも、日本がこれに参加してなると、在日米軍にひょっとしたら核が残るんではないか、あるいは核が持ち込まれるんではないかという疑いが出てくる可能性があります。それから次に、実は日本はですね、原子力発電の平和利用のプログラムから平和利用のための大量のプルトニウムを抱えています。世界で500トン以上のプルトニウムがある中の約 10% に近い47トンのプルトニウムを日本が持っています。これが日本の潜在的な核抑止力になるんではないかと疑われています。だから日本がもしですね、非核地帯に参加しないとなると、こういった懸念が増してくる可能性があります。したがって我々の提言は、日本はですね、この非核兵器地帯構想を支持してですね、北東アジア核地帯の確立に向けて、自らがこの構想を支持してリーダーシップを取るべきだ。そして、核の傘に頼らない安全保障政策に転換すべきだというのが、私たちのメッセージです。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
非常に分かりやすい話ありがとうございました。次に、ピーター・ヘイズさんから発言をいただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a great privilege to return to Nagasaki. I used to go to a lot of international conferences. I don't go to many other. But coming to Nagasaki for me is almost a pilgrimage, because I come here to be inspired by the citizens of Nagasaki and the survivors of Nagasaki, and to be reminded of why it is that we do the work that we do. So I'd like to thank the citizens here for hosting us and giving us their inspiration and opening their hearts and minds so that we can learn from their wisdom. In the last year, we've seen a sudden, abrupt, even incredible change. We have gone from being at the brink of war, we were told, to apparently the brink of peace, the outbreak of peace. And we have seen the emergence of the Prohibition Treaty at the same time as we are seeing the eruption of a new nuclear arms race. This is very bewildering, very perplexing, I think, this pace of change and this apparent contradiction, this apparent paradox. So I'd like to explore a little bit what is going on. In the course of doing that, we'll look very closely at the situation in Korea, and then we will look a little bit about where we are heading. In English, we have a saying that if you leave a port to go to sea, a port like Nagasaki, and you don't know your destination, you'll never arrive anywhere except by chance. That is not really a good way to plan it. So I will ask, what are some of the possible pathways across the ocean to arrive at a peaceful home port, both in Korea and regionally? So let's start with the issue of nuclear war. In 2013 to 2015, by any reasonable definition, both the United States and North Korean leadership engaged in a war of words, deployment of forces, redeployment of forces, testing of nuclear weapons, unprecedented rhetorical threats that met a definition of nuclear aggression under UN Security Council resolutions and I think under international law relating to aggression between states. But the strange thing is that having climbed up so high in the tree, these leaders then managed to find their way back down, at least close to earth, if not back on the ground. Perhaps this was not such a superhuman achievement to create the risk of war by such stupidity and by such irrational and non-strategic behavior. In this climb down from the tree, Kim Jong-un made the first move. It was actually Kim Jong-un who invited Donald Trump to a summit. And then Donald Trump, in the spirit of do anything but Obama, but lacking any other policy, said, yes, let's meet in Singapore. And they did. And now everything hangs in the balance of this summit tree, post-American elections. Anything could happen. Meanwhile, the prospects for peace, as one of the earlier speakers alluded to, is better than it's been since the guns fell silent in 1953. This is an amazing achievement, primarily because of the efforts of civil society, democratic uprising in 1987 to overthrow the military dictatorship, and then the candlelight revolution to overthrow the conservative government and to install a government that was willing to treat the North Koreans on co-equal terms. The end of the Korean War is actually not that difficult to achieve. Legally speaking, we are now in a Cold War. We are not at a state of war with North Korea. No one is at war with North Korea. And it would take a new act of war to resume the war. And there is no reason to go to war. There is no reason to use bullets or bombs to either keep the peace or end the war. The armistice can be ended, being the binding legal framework at this point. The armistice can be ended very easily, simply by statements by the leaders of the respective parties to the conflict. It could just be the two Koreas at this point. It could be the two Koreas in the United States. Just say it's over, we're not going to fight this war anymore. End of war. It could be a more formal treaty. It doesn't really matter. It's actually quite easy to end the Korean War. What's less easy to dismantle is the enormous means of war that were assembled around the demilitarized zone and across the entire region of the West Pacific, an archipelago of bases on the American side, and UN command, and I don't even know the current number, I think it's 14 allies, roughly, that are party to the Korean conflict. And in the way that the United States and North Korea and South Korea as the current primary interlocutors end the war, along of course with China and Russia being involved, and Japan as an ally of the United States also being involved, the way that it's ended really does determine everything else that follows in the region at this point. It is the pivot point, in my view, for US-China relations into the future. The United States and China face a choice, especially the United States. If they choose to resolve in a cooperative manner the Korean conflict and work together to support the two Koreas in the conflict resolution process, then they must enter on a concert, on a cooperative relationship on other security issues at the same time. if they decide instead to compete in many different ways across the entire region, it's very difficult to conceive the United States and China cooperating to support the inter-Korean process, which will make it much harder, will impose greater burdens on South Korea. Not impossible, but will make it much more difficult. So the stakes are very high at this point in what happens in Korea for the entire region. And as the previous speaker outlined, we know perfectly well at this point what has to happen for a concert. He outlined the 6 elements of ending sanctions, a permanent, irreversible security institutional framework, ending of hostility and building of trust, a peace treaty or a treaty of amity and cooperation as the political framework, some form of peace regime in Korea itself, and the attendant infrastructure and economic and energy assistance to North Korea, and then the very important legally binding framework of a nuclear weapons-free zone. Now, as the previous speaker alluded to, we do face a choice. We could try and update, if you like, the 1992 joint denuclearization declaration between the 2 Koreas. But that declaration was apolitical, not a legally binding document, for the simple reason that the 2 Koreas, even at this juncture, are competing states for the same territory, and neither will sign a treaty that implies that they have given up on their claims to be the sovereign state over the entire Korean peninsula. Also, the denuclearization declaration had no effective monitoring and verification of spectorate. It became moribund very quickly, and it had no equal framework for negative security assurances from China and Russia to South Korea and Japan, only an implication, never committed, that the United States would provide a nuclear negative security assurance specific to North Korea. This is not a durable framework today. We need a different kind of framework. So if we're only going to have an inter-Korean agreement in which to realize a denuclearization commitment that is really the only binding commitment on North Korea going back to September 2005 principles, anchored, in fact, in the 1992 bilateral denuclearization declaration, we do have to think bigger. And that, in fact, makes the region as a whole a beneficiary of the Korean process, because that will force the region to come to terms with some of the ways that nuclear threat is used in interstate relations involving Russia, China, Japan, and the United States. On the other hand, a 3+3 framework, desirable as it is as an end outcome, appears to be a reach too far for the 2 Koreas, especially for South Korea, even though its diplomacy has been incredibly adroit under Moon Jae-in. It's not clear that it has the power to move the whole region to a multilateral regional nuclear weapons-free zone, in part because of the animosity between China and Japan, the role of the so-called technological deterrent now actively used in a form of coercive diplomacy by Japan against China, and China's somewhat irrational but deep, even visceral fear of Japanese both rearmament and its nuclear armament in the future. That appears to be a very difficult issue. And so one suggestion is that the 2 Koreas adopt a standard UN multilateral treaty framework, leaving open the door for other parties to join later, such as Japan, or right at the outset. I can't see where ambassadors I can't expect, including Mongolia, for example, to make sure that it's a fully multilateral treaty. And it would be possible, even when it has nuclear weapons, for the DPRK to join at the outset a nuclear weapons-free zone, because over time it could come into full compliance. And whilst it is committed to a nuclear weapons-free zone in a legally binding treaty format, that forms a compliance substitute, if you like, for North Korea to have to observe before it comes back into full compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It cannot rejoin the NPT until it is fully nuclear disarmed and certified as such by the nuclear weapons states in the IAEA, through both the UN Security Council and the IAEA itself. We need a legal framework for the denuclearization and dismantlement of the nuclear weapons process for North Korea, and a nuclear weapons-free zone could be that interim substitute for a global framework being applied to Korea. But one of the reasons that it's so important to have a nuclear weapon-free zone created in the longer run in this region is because North Korea, from a nuclear weapons viewpoint, is a pipsqueak state. It's a tiny problem relative to the problem posed in this region and globally by the nuclear weapons states, particularly by the United States, China, and Russia. We have offshore from Japan in the Sea of Okhotsk in the North Pacific and the Mid-Pacific, and now in the oceans from southern China down in the South China Sea, an unprecedented deployment of nuclear-armed, missile-firing submarines. And with that goes the anti-submarine warfare, aerial, surface, and underwater. And this is happening at a time when there are disruptive technologies coming into play, such as autonomous vehicles, both in the air, surface, and underwater. We have artificial intelligence entering into the nuclear command and control systems, which are already automated. And this is happening at the speed of light, literally, in the three nuclear weapon states, especially China and the United States. We have quantum technologies coming online, which means that suddenly encryption and security of nuclear forces may be questionable, and also submarines may be sensed at great distance, so they'll no longer be hidden in the ocean. So we have a number of technologies. We have cyber warfare. We have a number of technologies that are going to destabilize whatever stability is left when you go from having 2, let alone 3, let alone 4 nuclear weapon states, a dual to a truel, T-R-U-E-L, as we say in English, a sword fight between 3 people, to a quadruple, a sword fight between 4 people, which is the case now in this region. So this complexity is now very dangerous, and we need to get a handle on it in a nuclear weapons-free zone and start that process. It won't finish it. We may need to bring in a post-INF or an expanded INF approach to this region, such that a zone could include partial coverage of China, the United States, and Russia. And I just want to remind everyone, something I learned recently, I did not know this until very recently. Puerto Rico in the United States falls under the Treaty of Tlatelolco, the Latin American Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty. There is no reason, for example, that Guam should not fall under such a treaty, and this is of great concern and importance to the North Koreans, given the centrality of Guam in any force projection against them in the future. Now, the previous speaker alluded to the operational arms control disarmament measures that are underway in Korea, and I think this is actually the most important reason to be optimistic today, is the speed and the depth at which those no-fly zones, ending of exercises, the removal of guard posts, the maritime security cooperation in the western disputed islands and seas area, etc. All these measures actually reduce the real military threat between the two Koreas, and therefore the salience of any nuclear weapons that might be brought to bear. It's the first time now that Koreans will really decide what's going to happen to Korea. This is incredibly important. No state, including the United States, has a veto anymore over what the two Koreas do with respect to their coming to terms with each other. And as part of that, the question of people-to-people implementation of all the different levels of nuclear governance that we've been talking about with respect to Korea, with respect to the nuclear weapon states in this region, I think is very important. 9 nuclear weapon states and 28 or 29 nuclear umbrella states currently include about 52–53% of the world's population. So the non-nuclear weapon states or the non-umbrella states is a slight minority of humanity at the moment. It will only take a very small number of the umbrella states, Korea and Japan, will be enough to move the non-nuclear states into a majority of humans on the planet. And so it's critical that not only we introduce the concept of human security going up to global and national level from the individual, as mentioned earlier, but we also push downwards from states to cities and provinces in a trans-governmental and cross-border manner, and include cities and provinces and corporations, as well as civil society organizations, in the implementation of the prohibition strategy. This should not just be a matter for states. And this is pretty much inevitable in my view, so that when you put out to sea from a port like Nagasaki or Busan or Wonsan, you don't just come to your own home port. Any port you pull into is a home port. So I'll leave it there.
ありがとうございました。では続いて、アンジェラ・キャニさん。
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I was look forward to speaking about one of my favorite topics, which is disarmament, obviously, and particularly in this region where this is, in this country, where this is of such utmost importance. Now, when I was asked to speak about North Korea, or rather about the Korean Peninsula, I mentioned that I've been spending the last couple of months in the United States, and so I would focus my remarks on the United States in this particular case. I would like to look a little bit at the background, at the factors that would affect President Trump's decision-making, and also make some reflections on the way forward. And when we look at the background, I'm not going to go back to the armistice and war, but on the other hand, I think that when we look at the efforts to limit North Korean nuclear capabilities, it really goes back decades. And it was always a process of one step forward and maybe 2 steps backward. But why? The aim of the US and other Western states was always the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. And this approach was also, if you remember, put initially forward by President Trump and his National Security Advisor, John Bolton. But when you go back to 2002, when then US President George W. Bush declared the axis of evil, which was Iran, Iraq, and the DPRK, this was very shortly after the September 11 attacks in 2001. And the mood was very different. It was very easy to rally the public with very belligerent words. We shouldn't forget that. And at that time, there was a very fragile agreement that Peter Hayes already referred to that was restraining DPRK's efforts to develop nuclear weapons, though the US had really dragged its feet on several parts of the agreement. And similarly, while North Korea had ended plutonium production, they secretly went to Pakistan to acquire gas centrifuge technology and equipment for uranium enrichment in order to produce fissile materials for nuclear weapons, and the US caught them at it. But the DPRK also had grievances. They claimed that the US did not abide by the deal, as they never normalized relations with Pyongyang, and then characterized the DPRK, as I mentioned, as part of this axis of evil. So that's when the agreement collapsed in mutual recriminations. DPRK withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and resumed full-scale nuclear weapons development efforts. Now, in the early 1990s, it's important to recall that the US intelligence community had estimated that by 2000, the DPRK could be producing 150 kilograms of plutonium per year. That's enough for about roughly 30 nuclear weapons, and they could have manufactured 100 nuclear weapons by that time. But instead, because of the negotiations, when George W. Bush came into office, North Korea had no nuclear weapons. And then, of course, there were no negotiations at all until President Trump entered the scene. Now, you know, and we all are aware that North Korea is the only country that has tested nuclear weapons in this century. There were 6 tests between 2006 and 2017. And also, as of November last year, North Korea had carried out 117 strategic missile tests. The first was already in 1984. Let me just mention one word about UN sanctions, because we shouldn't forget the sanctions that have been levied on North Korea over subsequent years. And right now they're still in effect until April next year. It only can be taken a decision by the Security Council to lift these sanctions. They've been tightened over the years, and they have really been biting quite a lot, particularly because oil products were most recently initiated. There were several country-specific non-proliferation issues discussed in the Security Council. Last year, for example, when the meeting was chaired in the Council by then U.S. Secretary of State Tillerson, and then it was followed by another ministerial level meeting in December last year, which was chaired by Foreign Minister Kono. And when he circulated a concept note prior to that meeting last year, he suggested that members focus on nuclear and missile development as well as other weapons of mass destructions. Now let me tell you that it's very difficult in the Council to respond quickly to even major violations, and so you haven't really heard very much in terms of presidential statements or press statements by the Council when violations were discovered. Now comes President Trump. And I think that we all recall that in the first months of his presidency, Mr. Trump repeatedly said that he would not live with North Korea being a nuclear power, and he promised he would solve the problem once and for all, since he had been left a mess by his predecessors. And in September last year, I think Peter already referred to this, then he sort of said at the podium of the General Assembly that if forced to defend itself or its allies, we would have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. I mean, that was really quite a statement from the podium of the General Assembly. I don't think the General Assembly delegates had ever heard something like this. But he also made a number of tweets that were very insulting. He talked about Kim Jong-un, a little rocket man, and he said that the DPRK's foreign minister won't be around much longer, etc., etc. I think we all recall this very insulting and in a very infantile language, and that was countered by North Korea, saying the US declared war on our country, and we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down US strategic bombers. Now that was the situation last year, and it is amazing how much has changed in just a number of months. And the statements coming out of North Korea, when you analyze them, are really very consistent, but those of the US really are not. Then Secretary Tillerson insisted that Kim Jong-un give up all his weapons. In August last year, he said, he simply must stop testing. And then the Trump's National Security Advisor, McMaster, insisted that North Korea would have to agree to highly intrusive inspections to determine the whereabouts of its nuclear weapons, and agreed to ultimately plan to surrender its nuclear arsenal. So the goalpost seems to be shifting, and it rather seems to be weakening rather than strengthening. But we should also remember that North Korea has never allowed inspectors far beyond the Yongbyon facility, which was already mentioned. And I think we also must remember that the arsenal is now enshrined in North Korea's constitution as something that really one wonders whether any official could trade it away. But of course the US insists that denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is the ultimate goal, as this was something that the two Koreas agreed on way back in 1992. And this progress would be, as the US insisted, incremental. I'm not going to go over the developments of this year with the Olympic diplomacy, and then also with the summit meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. I think it was very symbolic when you looked at it. The flags of the two countries were of equal size. Kim Jong-un was given a peer status with the US President, And I think there was a lot of views that were expressed on the presidential statement that was adopted because it had what many considered rather vague language as to its achievements. Now, what's happened since then? The remains of American POWs missing in action were repatriated from the DPRK. The test site at Pyongyang was destroyed, according to North Korea, though, of course, there was no verification. I think there were journalists that were invited, but there was no verification per se from people who had experience in the matter. The US ROK military exercise was suspended, no rocket launches or testing in over a year, and 3 visits by Secretary Pompeo to Pyongyang. Another one is planned, but this seems to be shifting in terms of when is it going to happen, and then there's a delay that seems to be, but the high-level inter-Korean diplomacy that was already referred to, which is after a hiatus of 11 years, was restarted, and not only restarted, but very rapidly intensified. Now, when we look at what happened in 2017, just last year, it's amazing how quickly it changes. Trump really was brinkmanship, and that is the scale of the high mountain that Peter Hayes referred to. But it seemed somewhat haphazard, somewhat impetuous, and really, as far as I was concerned, downright dangerous at times. But it did move the situation from a total stalemate to a politically dynamic process, even though there is really, I cannot really see a very distinctive strategy from the US as to next steps. Now, the language about the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization is now replaced by a more general term of denuclearization talks. And then, again, the visit that was planned by Pompeo in July, after his visit in July, North Korea rejected the gangster-like remarks, demands that he made. The planned trip for August was cancelled, and only after the inter-Korean summit rekindled the peace process, an exchange of letters between Kim and Trump softened the tone. And I think we all recall kind of odd tweets from President Trump where he said, we will prove, thank you, Chairman Kim, we will prove everyone wrong, and there's nothing but a good dialogue, and he claimed that he and the Chairman, Kim Jong-un, fell in love because of Kim's beautiful letters. That was really at the end of September. It was only like 2 months ago, if you think about it. Now, the preparations for a second Trump-Kim meeting are underway. Again, the goalpost has shifted. It's no longer going to be this year after the midterm elections, which took place last week, but now it's going to be sometime early next year. But on the other hand, it will happen. And Secretary Pompeo, of course, finished his trip to the region, during which he also visited Japan, China, and South Korea in early October. There was an announcement by Secretary Pompeo that North Korea would allow foreign experts, again, notice the vague language, foreign experts, to watch as North Korea shuts down key missile facilities. And he sort of said, Pompeo said that because there are these important commitments, the US is prepared to engage immediately in negotiations. Again, it's the strategy that I find is a little bit woozy and moving in fits and starts. But the fine print is really important because Chairman Kim suggested these and other actions would only happen if the US takes reciprocal action. But there was no mention of any deliverables, no first steps towards denuclearization, no inventory of nuclear weapons, its production, its storage sites, its missile and missile launches, and no schedule for dismantlements. Nor was there a list of items that North Korea, in turn, considered reciprocal by the US. Now, Trump, in my opinion, is clearly looking for a win, regardless of content. He considers himself as the ultimate deal maker, and he believes that previous US presidents were hoodwinked, both by Iran and the DPRK, and he already claims, and I quote, "there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea," unquote. As to Chairman Kim, the meeting with President Trump legitimized him and his regime worldwide, and the lack of concessions demanded of Kim gave him room to maneuver and sidestep the difficult issue of denuclearization, and now the asks have really to be made by the US negotiators because the political leverage that was there at the summit was not used effectively by Trump. And without the pressure, China and Russia are now calling for relaxation of sanctions, and Russia in particular has already been accused of disregard of the sanctions and of risk. Now let me make a couple more comments, and I will take maybe the 2 or 3 minutes that were from the first speaker not used. And that is the fallout in US ROK relations. What is shown in the last few months is that there really is a growing gap between Trump's goals and those of the South Korean president. And he and Chairman Kim have held 3 summit meetings, and there's even talk of Chairman Kim visiting Seoul later this year. We've all followed this very clearly in the press. But in an interview which he gave to the BBC in mid-October, President Moon said that it was only a matter of time before the US and North Korea declare an end to the state of war, which is a demand, of course, that the North has been repeatedly making. And he also said that European leaders would help him mediate between Mr. Kim and President Trump if negotiations stalled. And I find this is a really amazing statement when you look at the years, decades-long military lines that the US and South Korea has had. And the closer inter-Korean relations have emboldened North Korea to step up the demands, and they're asking that the US negotiators are more realistic on the deal sequencing, especially when it comes to normalization of relations and sanctions relief. Now, in the view of the US, and I've had extensive consultations there recently, the South Korean sanctions have not been helpful. I was even told by a senior US official that they had undermined the efforts of the US to make progress on denuclearization. And Secretary Pompeo was public in saying that there was discontent with the inter-Korean military pact that was reached during the Moon-Kim summit in September. But we must remember that this issue is not a bilateral or even a trilateral one. China, Russia, Japan are all major players in the Korean Peninsula, and their actions are closely watched. There was a communique in early October by China, North Korea, and Russia, reiterating the strong ties between the 3 countries and calling for loosening of the sanctions. Now, the situation is rapidly evolving. We don't really have a new normal in the new Korean Peninsula with the high-level talks, and also it has so far not resulted in any significant steps. But what it has done, and this is important, is that it has shifted the discourse from denuclearization to other actions, and as significant as they are taking away from the initial focus of the engagement, and that hampers very much the US, in their view also, of their negotiation strategy, because it boosts the DPRK instead of forcing it to take concrete steps towards nuclearization. Let me say 2 words about where does Japan fit in, because after all, this is where we are. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has clearly established a good relationship with President Trump, but there's now risk that Japan is getting left behind on the sidelines. Pompeo, as I mentioned, visited Japan 3 times during his trip to the region. The US has always played a stabilizing role in Northeast Asia. And unlike Europe, where we have a strong security pact, NATO, there's no equivalent multilateral structure in Asia. So withdrawing the US security presence could introduce a high level of uncertainty. And the continuity and predictability of US policy in Asia was also based on the importance of good trade and economic relations. But President Trump has upended this equation as well by pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and challenging China's behavior, imposing tariffs, accusing China of intellectual property theft and economic espionage. When the 6-party talks were established, the format included the major players which had interest in the Korean Peninsula. But while another Trump-Kim summit could inject energy into the process and be used to arrive at a defined roadmap, there's also the risk that it could all fall apart. And then what? After presidential summits, there is no plan B, and that is what I find a major concern. And with a US president who is inadequately prepared substantively, who admits to disliking detailed briefings and political detail, the risk for failure is strong. And critics believe that Kim's real intention is not to denuclearize, but to use the negotiations for a peace treaty that will drive out the nearly 30,000 American troops based in South Korea. I thank you for letting me go on for more minutes, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。スピーチが続いているので休憩に入りたいと思いますが、第2部ではですね、4人の方が登壇なさいます。で、現在の3人の方もそのまま残っていただきますので、全体が終わったところで皆さんからのご質問とかご意見を聞く時間を取りたいと思います。一旦休憩に入ります。10分間休憩